Hi, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be getting started in just a few minutes. We know it's lunchtime, so go ahead and grab your lunch, a snack, coffee, whatever you need, and get comfortable. And we'll be getting started right at 12:45. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we still have a few people trickling in, but we will get started in just a moment. I did just put in the chat a couple moments ago that if you have any questions for our presenter today, you can submit those using the Q&A function on the Zoom toolbar, which on my screen is right next to the chat, but it may appear in different locations for different folks. So please use that to submit your questions. We will be monitoring the chat, but sometimes things get a little lost in there. The Q&A tends to help streamline things a little bit. So without any further ado, I will turn things over to Alyssa Hoffman to kick us off for today's Learning Circle.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Hoffman. I'm a senior here at the University of Hartford, currently studying marketing through the 3+1 program. Outside of the classroom, I serve as Student Government Association President, where we advocate for student voices across campus. I would like to welcome you to today's conversation on the rise in extremism. These programs are vital to the continuous work that we do here at the university to promote and cultivate a vibrant and inclusive community. Hate has no place in this world, and it's our hope that these conversations are educational and provoke true question and ideas to help change our world. I challenge all of you to brainstorm 2 to 3 ways you can help battle the state of hate. How can you create support for either students, faculty, staff, or even a stranger on the street? How can you educate others and yourself more? Sadly, change cannot happen overnight, but that change starts with all of us today. Thank you for attending. I would like to now introduce Jake Joseph. Serving as ADL's Connecticut's Associate Regional Director, Jake's work focuses on incident response and statewide capacity building to fight hate and bias. Jake's love for challenge and community does not end there, as he also serves on committees, councils, and serves as a commissioner for Milford Housing and Redevelopment as well. Thank you, Jake, for your time, and the floor is yours.
Hello. Can you all see me? You can? All right, awesome. Hi, I'm Jake. I am the Associate Director here at the Connecticut office of the Anti-Defamation League. I first want to offer our gratitude to University of Hartford, to Alyssa and the students who've helped coordinate this, and also to Chris, Lisa, and all of the staff and professors who have supported this learning circle. Also to my colleague, Alex, from our national, international level of ADL for being our speaker. My job today is simply to offer a welcome from your local office. Here, Connecticut is one state, which is also one region of ADL. Our team involves professionals, about 7 of us, who work in areas of education, programming at all levels, but especially we run the No Place for Hate. Maybe some of you had schools that were part of No Place for Hate when you were in middle school or high school. We run different programs in that area. We also do incident response, which is my role. So if you ever hear of an incident of hate, bias, extremism, anti-Semitism, or other forms of bias, please go to our website or encourage those who experience the incident to do that and report an incident at the top. The form can triage to any part of the country. It doesn't have to just be a friend or person in Connecticut. ADL can respond elsewhere as well. We have a great team here in Connecticut. We're local. So my job is simply to say we're here and we're able to assist and be present. I want to introduce Alex Friedfeld. Alex is part of our National Center on Extremism from ADL. Alex has been with ADL for some time now, but before was with New York's Police Department in counterterrorism and intelligence. He has an MA or master's degree in terrorism and substate violence from Georgetown, and is an indispensable resource to those of us here in our region as one of our go-to people when we have questions about things we don't know about or need more insight on. So Alex, thank you for coming to Connecticut virtually. Welcome from your local office, and thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
Great, thanks, Jake. Hey, everybody. Great to be here. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you to everyone at the University of Hartford for putting this together, and thank you all for being here to talk about what I think is a really important issue, and that is the state of extremism in Connecticut. As Jake mentioned, I'm one of the investigative researchers with our Center on Extremism, and we are basically the arm of the ADL that is tasked with monitoring, exposing, and disrupting violent extremism. And basically what that means is that I am essentially spending all of my time in these extremist spaces, watching what these guys are talking about with an eye towards trying to understand what's driving them, and more importantly, what are they planning for the real world, right? Whether it's propaganda campaigns, protests, criminal activity, and occasionally even violent acts. So essentially what that means is that I have a front row seat to, everything that's happening in the extremism space. And what my colleagues and I have been finding is that, we are currently experiencing a boom in extremism across the country, right? And that shouldn't come as a shock. If you're looking at the headlines over the last few weeks and months, you'll know that that will ring true, right? That we are, everywhere kind of experiencing this again, boom of extremist related activity across the country. So what I want to do today is use my time to talk about how that extremism is manifesting in Connecticut. So just, it's one thing for me to say there's a boom. It's another to kind of see it, right? So Here you've got one of the tools that we have, our heat map. I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation a little bit more, but basically this is set to all extremist related activity that we counted just 3 years ago in 2019, right? 65 incidents, mostly white supremacist propaganda, as well as anti-Semitic incidents, one shootout involving a white supremacist, right? One white supremacist event. Flash forward 3 years though to this year, and you see there's been 220 incidents across the state, right? Again, mostly white supremacist propaganda, but that's an alarming increase in this type of activity that we are witnessing. And we're not, all of these numbers are just through August, right? Which means we're only 2/3 of the way, if my math is right, 2/3 of the way through the year. And so likely this number is going to continue to uptick by the time we do the final tally, right? So this is obviously deeply disturbing. But I want to talk about who are the groups that are driving this, and what does this actually mean? So the way I thought I'd do that is I start by talking about white supremacist groups that are active across the state, right? Because as you can see, they are primarily responsible for this increase. Before shifting to talk about a couple other groups, being the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, before talking about what everyone can do to deal with extremism. So let's talk white supremacy. Just as a quick kind of primer on white supremacy, white supremacist ideology is basically guided by 3 tenets, right? First, the idea that white people are genetically and culturally superior to other races. The second tenet being that because of this perceived superiority, white people should either have their own, state where they basically live amongst themselves, and if not, they should be the ones that are dominating any place that they are, right? They should be the one dictating the way that things work. And lastly, the last kind of key tenet is this idea that white people are currently facing extinction, right? That they are undergoing a so-called white genocide. Usually that they believe that Jewish people are responsible for this, but basically that the white race is under threat. And that's really important because if you believe that you are under threat, right, that you are facing extinction, all of a sudden the stakes of the moment become much higher. And this has become a very effective narrative in terms of getting people to act in the real world. Nominally, again, to save their race, to save their family, to save everything that they love. So when we talk about white supremacist activity in Patriot Front, the biggest driver behind it is a group called Patriot Front. Patriot Front is a Texas-based white supremacist group that operates across the country. And what they do is they fuse patriotism with a neo-fascist ideology under the guise of preserving America's European American identity. They were founded back in 2018 by a then 20-year-old named Thomas Ryan Rousseau, who helped to kind of bring this Gen Z understanding of the internet to white supremacy. The group mandates that its members have to regularly act in the real world, right? Which explains the sheer amount of propaganda that they put out. And they actually have a quota system in place to ensure that members keep up, otherwise they're going to be kicked out, right? And one of the things that makes Patriot Front stand out among all the other white supremacist groups is the fact that they actually try to disguise what they're about in public, right? And what I mean by that is if you come across their propaganda in the wild, it's likely that you won't even think it's white supremacist content at first glance, right? Unless you know what they're about, right? And it's actually really easy to confuse them for a hyper-nationalist group, right? And to that end, they'll use slogans like America First or, United We Stand or Reclaim America or Against the State for the Nation, right? All these types of, again, kind of nationalistic slogans. And when you look at their imagery, it's really not over the top, right? It's actually pretty stylized, right? And it's certainly nothing like your typical white supremacist propaganda, which can often feature, slurs or violent imagery. And again, right, if you see this stuff, it's not hard to imagine how people can get tricked into thinking, it's a more mainstream group, right? And that's all by design. They're trying not to repel people. And they want to get people curious enough about the message that they'll go online and look for additional information. Now, when that happens, right, most of the time people will click away when they see the white supremacist content that's there. But the fact is that not everyone will. And so that helps them to grow their numbers, to gain new recruits, gain new resources, and spread their message. So Patriot Front has been very prolific over the last few years. And when you look at kind of the overall amount of white supremacist propaganda across the country over the last few years, right? They basically are responsible. When you look at it for 2021, they're responsible for 82% of white supremacist propaganda across the country, right? And this is a sharp uptick of what we saw, again, just a few years ago, right? Between 2019 and 2020, the number of white supremacist propaganda doubled in the country, and then it has basically stayed even in 2021. As of this year, it looks like we're going to experience another uptick about this, right? And the fact that this kind of rise started in 2018 isn't surprising, given that that is the year that Patriot Front was created, right? So again, they're the ones driving basically everything. And unfortunately, Connecticut has not been immune to that. Already this year, we have tracked 192 incidents of white supremacist propaganda in the state, the overwhelming majority of which is from Patriot Front. This is up from 97 instances last year, right? So over about 100 more cases already this year. And again, we're not done with the year. And up from 27 cases in 2019, right? So again, this sharp uptick in activity in the state. But unfortunately, it's not just propaganda that we worry about with Patriot Fronts. They also like to hold marches in various places, in various cities across the country, places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., as we saw, just a few months ago in Boston. These guys always show up in the same uniform, right? Khaki pants, blue shirts, and masks. And they use these marches as a way to sow fear in local communities, demonstrate their strength, and as propaganda to attract new recruits. Typically, these guys don't engage in physical violence during their marches. They're usually there just to kind of show force and intimidate, but that isn't always the case. Actually, at that march in Boston, some Patriot Front members did scuffle with counter-protesters, and one Black man was reportedly assaulted during it. And the reason why we're concerned about this is these marches is obviously that they, can intimidate local communities, but they're also held as flash marches, right? So they can really happen anywhere at any time, which is why we always keep an eye out on them. The second group that I want to talk about that's been active in the state is the Nationalist Social Club, also known as NSC 131. This was a group that was founded in 2019 in Eastern Massachusetts. And it's a neo-Nazi group that first began as a group dedicated to covering up anarchist and gang graffiti with their own graffiti. But they've since grown to see themselves as soldiers at war with what they believe is a hostile Jewish-controlled system that they think is deliberately plotting the extinction of the white race. And so to combat this, NSC is working to form an underground network of white men who are willing to fight their perceived enemies through localized direct action, right, including flash demonstrations as well as counter-protests. These guys have small autonomous chapters in every state, including Connecticut, and they are active across New England. As for membership, we estimate that there are between 35 and 40 members across all of the New England chapters. But given the number of actions that the group carries out, it can often feel like there are more people. But usually, it's the same people who tend to show up for different acts, right? But even with this overlap, it's clear that NSC has grown over the last year, right? This time last year, their events were maybe attracting 5 to 10 people, but now they're regularly able to draw, between 15 and 20 people, and sometimes even more than that to their events. The biggest concern we have regarding NSC is their protests, right? Which have not only been happening at an increased rate over the last few months, but have grown increasingly aggressive, right? So starting with frequency. In the past, NSC used to hold events, maybe once a month. But in the first part of this year, we saw them up their rate of events to almost every other week. They haven't quite maintained that clip over the last few months, but they're still making their presence known. And actually on Sunday, they just held a protest in Massachusetts. As I said, though, right, it's not just the frequency that's alarming, but how they've become more targeted and aggressive in their protests. So in the past, an NSC protest was more likely to just be them standing out in front of a venue while holding signs, right, kind of rather static in what they are. But lately, we've seen them grow more confrontational, including getting in the faces of those that they consider to be enemies, right? And yelling slurs at them and harassing them. And as a result, a few NSC people have been arrested in connection to these protests. While we haven't seen any NSC protests in Connecticut yet, they did meet in New Haven back in May, as you can see here. And given their activity across the region, right, I wouldn't be surprised to see them show up at some point to carry out a protest. What we have seen from NSC in Connecticut are propaganda drops. Already this year, we have counted 17 different instances of propaganda being shared across the state in places like New Milford, Meriden, Waterford, Middlesex, and a bunch more, right? And these are really disturbing, right? They could really kind of intimidate and put fear in a neighborhood, right? And here's an example of a piece of propaganda that was reported to us, right? And a quick scan of this message, right, shows a lot of white supremacist themes, including this idea that white people need to unite against immigrants and Black people, and that it is up to white people, right, to ensure their own security, right? Putting this idea in their head that people need to be prepared to fight and need to band together, again, against this hostile Jewish controlled system. They'll also do banner drops to get their message out, right? Like this anti-LGBTQ message that they hung over a highway in Meriden on September 10th. And again, the whole point of this is to attract attention, and to get people interested in their message with the hopes of increasing their numbers and raising resources for their efforts. The last kind of network in terms of white supremacy that I want to talk about is the Goyim Defense League. The Goyim Defense League is a loose network of individuals connected by their virulent anti-Semitism. These guys seek to denigrate Jews and spread anti-Semitic myths as well as conspiracies, like the idea that Jewish people control the government and the media, the idea that the Holocaust is fake, and that Jews are responsible for tragedies like 9/11. As opposed to Patriot Front and National Social Club, anti-Semitism and not white supremacy is the GDL's primary mode of hate. And they say that they want to unite all races against the Jews. That said, right, their beliefs often map neatly onto white supremacist groups, and white supremacy is increasingly becoming pervasive within GDL. The main thing that these guys do is engage in real-world anti-Semitic stunts and schemes that are designed to troll Jews that they will then kind of tape and then blast out over their streaming platform in order to raise money. In the past, we haven't seen much GDL activity in New England, but that started to change this past year, as there's been a sharp uptick across the region in their activity. As part of all of this, in June, we spotted the first known GDL propaganda in Connecticut, when a supporter filmed themselves dropping propaganda off in Waterbury. And what this propaganda looks like, right? You can kind of see an image there, but this is what the propaganda looks like, right? And they aren't shy in their messaging and the anti-Semitism of all of it. These guys aren't as prolific in terms of their output as Patriot Front or NSC, but they have increased their propaganda output since the December of last year. And again, numerous communities across New England has been affected by it, right? And what I want to point out here, right, is notice the contrast in the propaganda, right, between this and say Patriot Front, right? Remember, Patriot Front was very restrained in their messaging, right, trying not to overtly kind of repel people. GDL does not care about that at all, right? They're flashy and splashy in terms of their hate and exactly signaling out exactly who they think is the enemy, right? And they include things like QR codes, right, to make it easy for you to go, if you are interested in this stuff, to connect with them, to find them, to start consuming this content and become radicalized yourself. One of the big things that the GDL does is they host these things called Name the Nose tours, right? An anti-Semitic reference. And basically these tours are, when GDL supporters from around the country gather in one area for 10 to 15 days and engage in trolling stunts and propaganda distributions. right? And what you see on this slide is kind of an example of what they do on these tours. In the past, they've demonstrated in front of ADL offices as well as synagogues. They've held banner drops that are anti-Semitic in nature. They'll spread propaganda like you just saw in local communities in order to get the word out. They'll impersonate themselves, using stereotypes as Jewish people and go around harassing people, right? And generally, they're just acting like all around awful people. But the primary point of all of this is, again, monetization. Every little thing that they do gets turned into content for their streaming platform. So what they'll do is they'll try and go out and get a rise out of people, in any way that they possibly can, because that's what they know will sell. Think of how the internet works. It rewards the most outrageous behavior, out there. And that's what these guys are tapping into. They know that the more outrageous they are, the more clicks they'll get, the more donations they'll get. And so the more economically, beneficial it is to them, right? What sells in this space, like the rest of the internet, is confrontation, right? Be it with Jews or with minorities. And this is really a problem, right? This is dangerous because what they have essentially done is monetized anti-Semitic behavior. And again, the more outrageous the act, the more money they can make. So it's not hard to see how this can get dangerous, really quickly. So that's kind of a summary of white supremacy in the area. But like I said, there's other types of extremism that are active in Connecticut. One of the big ones being the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys are a group that like to present themselves as a pro-Western fraternity, that they basically say that they are the ones who are just trying to protect Western civilization, right? But what they really are is a hate group that traffics in all different types of hate, whether it's racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, Islamophobia, homophobia, right? If there's a type of hate, they traffic in it. These guys have a national presence, but they also have local chapters that are, that have to adhere to the bylaws, but generally have a lot more free reign in terms of the actions that they're able to take. And we have seen them become a frequent presence at right-wing events across the country. Obviously, most famously at the January 6th insurrection, where numerous members are now facing serious charges in connection to their actions on that day. But what these guys, the reason why we care about these guys is because they are regularly involved in street violence, frequently targeting the left, right? And here's kind of some examples of what we have seen Proud Boys do over the last few years, right? Attacking counter-protesters with bear spray, physically assaulting, shooting people with paintball guns. And in the worst case, right, in Portland, actually drawing arms and opening fire on counter-protesters, exchanging in gunfights in the streets. Right? This stuff is really obviously dangerous and a concern for any community that they are operating in because it raises the potential for violence in those communities. And unfortunately, there is a chapter of Proud Boys in Connecticut. Thankfully, we have not seen them engage in much local activity, ranging from street fights, but even showing up in public rallies or events. But what we have seen them do, and this is really interesting, we have seen them try to make donations in the Proud Boy name to local charities. And the reason why these groups do this is because they're trying to engender goodwill. They're trying to get good headlines. They're trying to make inroads in local communities to make them think that the Proud Boys are there to protect them, that they are there to help, right? And what that will do is make the idea of the Proud Boys seem more benign, right? Puts a benign face on their hate and makes them seem more accessible, right? And potentially open the door for people who might be interested in joining, right? Because in their minds, they're not the people that are associated with the insurrection. They're the people who are just trying to make donations, in local charities, right? But thankfully, we have seen these charities, recognize the Proud Boys for what they are, and they have turned away these donations. And again, it is always important to remember the hate and the extremism that undergirds the Proud Boy ideology, and the fact that they are willing to conduct violence or enact violence in order to achieve their objectives. The last group I want to talk about is the Oath Keepers. The Oath Keepers are a far-right anti-government extremist group that is part of the militia movement. And what that means is that these guys believe that the federal government is trying to, has been co-opted by some sort of conspiracy, and that is actively trying to strip Americans of their rights and liberties with the ultimate aim of enslaving the people. What sets the Oath Keepers apart, though, from the rest of the militia movement is the fact that they explicitly target current and former military, law enforcement, emergency services personnel with their messaging and recruitment efforts, because essentially they believe, well, for two reasons, right? The first being that these guys have unique skill sets that the Oath Keepers believe that they can tap into in case they ever want to use them. And I can talk about that in a minute. But the second, right, is they believe that if an unconstitutional order were ever issued, it would be up to these individuals to ensure that that order never came to pass, right? That they want to reach these people to ensure that they are prepared to refuse and even resist any unconstitutional order that they might receive. But this talk of unconstitutionality is really kind of a trap, right? And often, and really basically every time, and the reason why they use this language of constitutionality, right, is because, who's for unconstitutional orders, right? But the reality is that their kind of, legal analysis or their analysis of what is or what isn't constitutional has no legal basis and is usually warped by conspiracy. And it often just reflects things that they just disagree with, right? But the reason why we can care about groups like the Oath Keepers and the militia movement writ large is because they believe that it is up to them. It is up to them to prepare to resist any efforts by the government to try and enslave the people, right? And they're preparing for that moment. And we saw that come to that the end conclusion, the logical conclusion of that belief play out on January 6th, where members of the Oath Keepers, said that they were going there to prevent tyranny from being imposed, which they believe that, if the Biden administration were to take office, that is exactly what would happen, right? There was this belief that they needed to fight then in order to prevent a bloodier civil war from taking place down the line. So back in September, we actually put out a report that went through a database leak that listed every single individual who paid money between 2009 and 2018 to the Oath Keepers, paid membership dues to the group. Just as a caveat, right? Just because a person paid money to the group doesn't mean that they are still an active Oath Keeper, and we don't know the extent to which they engaged with the group. That said, right, this is a group that has been extremist since their founding back in 2009, right? They're predicated on the idea that the people need to be ready to resist a tyrannical government. And the fact that any part of this anti-government message resonated with an individual to the point that they felt it necessary to, send $50 to the group is obviously deeply concerning. So what we did is we went through, this membership leak with an eye towards identifying key people holding key and sensitive positions across the country, right? And we looked at law enforcement, members of emergency services, as well as elected officials, right? All people who hold power, that wield this power, that basically, that hold power and can use this power to shape their communities, right? Because obviously the concern in these cases is that if they, they support the Oath Keeper ideology, that raises serious questions about their ability to protect everybody within their community. And so you see some of the numbers that we found here, right? 81 people holding public office or running for public office in 2022. And this ran the full gamut from, local office like mayors and town councilmen, all the way up to state senators. We also identified 373 people that we believe to be currently serving actively in law enforcement across the country, ranging again from street patrol officers up to and including sheriffs and police chiefs as well. And we also identified folks in the military that we believe are serving in a wide range of capacities, right? And again, the reason why we care about this stuff is all these people have power that they could potentially wield to the detriment of their community. And again, unfortunately, Connecticut wasn't immune to this. We found 5 active law enforcement in the state, 5 active members of the military, 5 first responders, right, for a total of 15. But one point I want to make with this is, right, there were 476 people who paid, dues to the Oath Keepers. That's a lot of people. And yet only 15 of them were, the people that the Oath Keepers were trying to recruit into their cause. And that's alarming to me, because that means that this anti-government message has success, or has had some success in terms of permeating society writ large, going beyond the people that the Oath Keepers are trying to target and reaching people like teachers, business owners, seemingly ordinary Americans, right? And, convincing them that the Oath Keepers, agenda was one that is necessary to support, which is deeply alarming, again, given their anti-government bent. So that's a lot of stuff I threw at all of you. But I want to shift now to talking about what we at the ADL are doing to combat this, as well as what, folks like yourself can do, right? So as I said, right, we spend our days in these spaces looking at what extremists are talking about with an eye towards getting them, getting understanding of what is happening here. And, intelligence is useless if it just sits with us. And so we work a lot to put out a lot of resources for the public to help inform them about what's going on, right? So one of the major things that we do are these large scale reports, of which the Oath Keepers report was one of the ones that we did, right? And these will usually, highlight key trends in the area, in this space, about what is going on, so that people understand and, get a sense and can understand what exactly is happening. We also have backgrounders up on basically every major extremist movement and group that is out there, and many minor ones as well. And these are really useful tools in case you're trying to understand, what exactly a group that is in the news is about, or maybe you're, there's some propaganda or activity in your area, or you want to get a sense of what they're about. These backgrounders are really useful. Not only do they explain the group's ideology, they walk you through kind of the structure of the group, who the key figures are, what are their ultimate goals and aims, and finally, criminal activity that groups have been associated with. So again, you can kind of get a full sense of what they're all about. You've seen a few examples of our heat map already in this presentation, but this is a really awesome tool that is great to get a visual sense of the state of extremism, in the country today. What this map tracks are a wide variety of things, including anti-Semitic incidents, white supremacist propaganda, white supremacist events, extremist plots as well as attacks, shootouts between law enforcement and extremists, right? Again, a bunch of different things, of which there are more things on there. And what makes this tool really useful is it's really easy to manipulate, right? You can adjust it by time, right? So let's say you're interested in seeing how extremism has changed 5 years ago to today, right? You can go back and look at the numbers in 2017 and compare them to today. Or you could do a time range, right? How is extremism between 2017 and 19 change, that 3-year period changed, over a 3-year period of 2019 to 2022, right? Whatever you want to do, you can change it by time. And you can also change it by location, right? So obviously we have a national map that you see here, but as I showed you, right, you can look at and zoom in into a particular state like Connecticut and get a sense of what's going on. And actually you can even zoom in even closer to look at a specific city to get a sense of what's going on. So you can look at Bridgeport, you can look at, Hartford, right? You can get it, you can look and see what is going on in your community. Another tool that we have is our hate symbols database, which is really important because this database can help you get a sense of whether or not there might be an extremist within your community. There are 214 symbols that are in this database right now, but we are constantly updating it with new symbols that might, come into play, that might take on relevance. And again, these symbols run the gamut of all different types of extremism. But it's really important to understand symbols because extremists rely on symbols to do two things. The first is that obviously they are used as a means of intimidation, right? Think of the fear that a Jewish family would have if a swastika were painted on, on their property, or if a swastika showed up on a synagogue, right? It sends a message of hate that they are not welcome in this community and that they should leave. And obviously that is not okay. But the other thing is that symbols can be used by extremists to identify other extremists, right? So a lot of the symbols that are in here are kind of more arcane. They aren't the obvious ones like a swastika, for example. But think about, if you're an extremist trying to figure out who in your community you can talk to, right? If you slap a swastika on your neck or on your, in a place where other people can see, obviously you're going to open yourself up to, social backlash, stigma, all these types of things, right? And people will not want to talk with you. But you can always tattoo another symbol, right? A less known symbol like a SS bolt or a Totenkopf, for example, or a follow rune, right? Things that, only other extremists will recognize as having extremist connection, right? And that creates an opportunity for people to connect without other people realizing what exactly is happening, right? So it's really important to understand how extremists use symbols. Because again, it could be a means of spreading hate as well as connecting people and advancing the extremist causes. And the last tool we have is something that we actually started this year, that is the Glossary of Extremism. And this is something that is really cool. It's got over 1,000 entries already. And again, we are continuously updating this so that it is as relevant as it can possibly be. So in this glossary, you'll find not just all the symbols in the hate symbol database, but you'll also find, definitions for key movements and groups, key ideological terms, things like the Great Replacement, for example. You'll find, key extremist events, explanations for key conspiracies like QAnon, right? Just basically a wide range of things, right? If you could think of it, if it has an extremist connection, odds are there is a definition here, right? So if you come across something in your daily life, this could be a really good place to just kind of go and look, and see if it has an extremist nexus. Or again, if you're trying to further understand what's happening in the news, again, a resource for you to kind of to learn more about what's going on. But, obviously this is a problem that is affecting all of us. And while, we at the ADL are doing as much as we possibly can to kind of help address this, obviously this is going to take all of us, right? This is going to need all of society approach if we're going to combat extremism and turn back the tide. Right, so here's a kind of a few things that you can do in your day-to-day life, right? And the first is easy enough. If you haven't contacted your elected officials about our Protect plan, you should definitely do so, right? And you can find this on our website. This is a really cool policy proposal that recognizes that there is no silver bullet for combating extremism, right? That we really need a multifaceted approach to address it, right? So this proposal calls for things like funding those who are combating domestic extremism, right? Making sure that the agencies that are trying to deal with this have the resources that they need to be successful. It also calls for putting pressure on social media companies to ensure that these platforms are not becoming microphones for hate and that they are not, enabling the radicalization of Americans, right? To put pressure on them to ensure that they are doing what they can to ensure that, our loved ones, that our communities are safe from extremists, right? Because it's not unreasonable for Americans to expect, especially given how much time we spend online, that the places that we are going are, free of extremist content and that people who are perusing these spaces can do so safely. And also, calls for, investing in counter messaging programs, right? So obviously a lot of extremists rely on messaging to get the word out. And there are tools that we can use to try and combat those messages in order to disrupt, the radicalization process to limit their reach and ensure that people remain safe. The second thing you can do, and really this in many ways I think is actually the most important thing, is, report. So what I mean by that is report this, not just to law enforcement, but to the ADL as well. Obviously, it's important to report to law enforcement so that they are aware of it and they can actually, investigate and see what's going on, and potentially hold those who are responsible, those who are responsible accountable for their actions. It's also really important to report it to us, right? Because the fact is we get our data from a wide variety of sources, but one of the best places that we get our data from is from our community, people in the community, right? Who can inform us about things, that, law enforcement or the news aren't aware of, right? And what this does is it gives us a better sense about what is going on. enables us to be more effective in our messaging, to be more effective in our, our lobbying, and to be more effective in designing policies that could potentially counter everything that's happening, right? Because the fact of the matter is, when it comes to combating extremism, the first step to doing so is understanding the scope of the problem. So the more data that we have, right, the clearer picture we will have about the nature of the threat, and the better we can kind of the better that we can be to combat it. And the last thing, right, as you've kind of seen already, right, is that we have a wide range of products about extremism that are available online. And the fact of the matter is, right, that a lot of this combating of extremism comes down to the individual, right, to calling it out in your life, and to, working with people in your life who might be engaging in hate, right? So we encourage you to share our resources with your partners, with your people in your community, with loved ones, things of that nature, right? Both to inform them about what's going on, but also because it may help them in the event that they are potentially falling prey to some of these extremist ideologies, right? Because a lot of these extremists rely on rhetorical tricks or on presenting themselves as actually benign, right? Think back to the Proud Boys and their engagement in their attempts to engage in charity, right? So they try and put on this nicer face so that they can draw people in, right? But obviously that is a cover for their extremist activity and what they are truly about, and so sharing these resources with people in your community can go a long way in terms of making sure that these extremist groups don't get a foothold in our communities. So that's a lot that I just threw at you. And I will stop there. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take any that there might be.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maddie Johnson. I am a senior health science major and also president of the Commuter Student Association. At this time, I encourage everybody to ask questions utilizing the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. We will try our best to answer as many questions as we can in the given time. Thank you. Okay, so the first question that we have is, given your work, have you ever been personally targeted by any of these groups?
Thankfully, I have not been personally targeted, but that, I have seen my name float around in these spaces, and that's always disturbing. But it is something that we are very aware of, again, given the nature of our work and the fact that, we are responsible for, again, shining a light on these guys, and in some cases, doing what we can to work with law enforcement to ensure that they are held accountable. So it is a risk that comes with the job and the work that we do, but one that we have a great team to kind of help to deal with. And again, given the importance of the work, I think the risk is worth it, right? It is something, this stuff is necessary. The work that we do is necessary and important. And, if you kind of give into extremism pressure, they win. And so we do what we can. Again, we have security, we have measures in place, but the work is important and we're not going to let them stop us.
Okay, so another question that we have is, if the Oath Keepers are comprised of a lot of law enforcement, how can we trust that reporting things to law enforcement will actually help?
That's a really important question, and a key one, given, again, we have seen reports, not beyond the Oath Keepers, of extremists within law enforcement. I think two things, right? The first, and I want to take it in two parts, right? I'll start specifically with the Oath Keepers, but then talk broadly about, the phenomenon of extremism in law enforcement. So when it comes to the Oath Keepers, we have alerted every single law enforcement agency that was affected to the fact that one of their colleagues showed up in this database, right? And we have heard back from many of these law enforcement agencies that they are disturbed by these reports and that they are investigating it to the extent that they can, and will hold, if they determine it necessary, they will hold them accountable, right? So I think that's really reassuring in that they recognize the threat that is there and that they are dealing with it. So they are aware when it comes to the Oath Keepers. But beyond that, again, the problem of extremism in law enforcement is really important. But I think it's kind of I think one of the important things to remember is that the prevalence of this extremism with law enforcement is really small. There are over 900,000 law enforcement officers in this country, and the rates of extremism are very low from what we have seen in terms of actual extremists. Obviously, there are other issues in terms of bigotry and hate, but what we have seen is that, especially from our work with law enforcement, is that they are very interested in weeding this stuff out, right? They know that there is a problem with extremism and they are doing what they can to deal with it. But they understand that the presence of extremists within the ranks of law enforcement undermines the very mission that they are trying to do, right? So they are very sensitive about that fact, and are doing what they can to deal with it. So, obviously, or it is very important, or the issue of extremism within law enforcement is very important, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't reach out if, for example, your communities are, you're dealing with extremism within your community, because they are often the first line of defense in terms of preventing it. But, if you are experiencing law enforcement, again, reach out to other folks, the ADL, but other institutions as well, so that everyone is aware, if you think, for example, that law enforcement isn't taking the claim seriously.
Okay, so the next question is, how involved are women in these groups? Are they allowed to join, or is it mostly for men?
That is a really good question. So the overwhelming majority of the extremists in the groups I talked about are men. I think it comes down to kind of the nature of the groups and what they believe, right? A lot of them are about, turning the clock back, to the so-called golden days, right, where men were dominant. So for example, you won't find women in the Proud Boy ranks. There are female oath keepers, not that many. It's a smaller percentage, but they do exist. And all that type of, and especially with white supremacist groups, again, they're going for a more patriarchal society. Think of like the meme of the trad wife, a woman who is in the kitchen, right, and all this type of stuff. Kind of, again, these old ideas that should have no place in society today. That said, even if they aren't formal members, extremism is not unique to, or is not only, in the purview of men. We do see extremists, white supremacists, militia men, I noticed the thing, militia people, people who do succumb to these ideologies, even though they are women. It is something that affects all of society. So even if they aren't necessarily part of a formal group, it is still of concern to us. But again, a lot of these groups are misogynistic in nature, and so that limits the involvement of women. Though sometimes they will use them as kind of a nicer face, if you will, right, to try and normalize some of their hate.
The next question is, how do the attacks on reproductive freedoms fit into the agenda of white supremacy and replacement propaganda?
So when I first started, when I talk about kind of the tenets of white supremacy, right? The third one I mentioned was this idea that there's a white extinction going on. And a lot of extremists, particularly white supremacists, believe that abortion plays a key role in that, right? That people are encouraging are killing white babies. Right. And again, they will often point to Jews as being responsible for the normalization of abortion in society and say that they did that because, again, they're actively trying to, limit white birth rates, to nominally, kill white children, basically, even though obviously scientifically that is not what's happening. But it does play a key role in terms of their narrative and their messaging. Right. So we have seen a lot of white supremacists get motivated to attack, abortion centers and things of that nature, driven by this belief, again, that, they need to do so in order to protect the white race and ensure that there is a future for white people.
Do you have any suggestions of how we as a university can conduct comprehensive training for all, even those who might agree with some portions of the far right ideology?
Yeah, look, I think, part of it, there will always be people who disagree with what is being said. But I think the more that campuses prioritize right? Spreading the word about extremism. Because I think part of the problem for a lot of people is they aren't necessarily aware of what exactly these groups are about, right? Think about what I was saying before about like the nice face that they will try and put on. You know, Proud Boys doing charitable events, and Oath Keepers do the same thing, right? We'll see a lot of militias engage in kind of community events in order to kind of put this nice face on. But it's important to call them out and to recognize it for what it is. And so a key part of that is education. And I don't think, you know, the idea that there may be people who sympathize with some of these ideologies in the crowd should deter, you know, campuses from putting these events on and trying to get the word out about what is going on. Because again, the more that people are aware of what's happening, right, the more the light is shined on these dark spaces, the more effective we will be at combating it. And by the way, if you are interested, I mean, I'm sure Jake, you know, you can reach out to Jake, and there's more programs that we can do. We have a whole education arm that can help to kind of deal with all of these types of things.
I have seen vehicles on campus that belong to contractors bearing stickers with some of the symbols you've shown. I think it was the Oath Keepers. Is there anything we can do to report that?
I mean, first, obviously, if they're on campus, you can alert campus officials to that fact, right? Especially if they do have extremist connotations. That is something that will absolutely be aware, they will want to be aware of. And then report it to us, and we will do what we can, you know, to help or provide guidance in those cases. You know, sometimes that may be a briefing to folks, right? To be like, hi, that, you know, not to the individual itself, but right, working with campus officials to inform them about what is happening, right? So let's say the 3%ers, right? The Roman numeral 3 with 13 stars around is a very increasingly common symbol that we are seeing, you know, across the country, that many people will use, or they'll claim to use, because they think, oh, it's just, you know, a patriotic symbol, or it's something associated with the military, right? Whether they're lying or not, right? They pretend they are saying that basically they don't realize the extremist connotation. And that's where we step in to be like, no, this is the long history of the symbol. And here's, you know, the violent acts that have been associated with it, right? So again, I think education is key here. And so letting your campus officials know that this is happening, so that they can look into it, but also letting us know that so that we could potentially provide resources to help.
The next question is, with the laws in Texas against gender affirming care, it seems comments on social media in gender spectrum spaces are getting more extreme. Are these groups that were very active on your map in Texas joining this type of extremist hate?
Yeah, unfortunately, attacks on the trans community have been increasing across the country. And we are seeing extremists engage with that. You know, they absolutely piggyback on it. Proud Boys have been protesting over the last few weeks at, you know, drag queen shows and things of that nature. And obviously that's not, it's a slightly different realm of things. But again, it's part of the broader attacks on the LGBT community. And so they are absolutely looking at these attacks as ways to kind of, you know, piggyback and try and, you know, they will frequently piggyback off of issues that are in the news and use that as an opportunity to recruit. But I think it's also important to remember, you know, that unfortunately this type of hate goes beyond just extremist groups. You know, this is something that we are watching happen in society that is really scary and really alarming. You know, that it isn't necessarily just Proud Boys or white supremacists that are involved with it. It is all different types of groups and people who are doing it. And I think it brings up an important point, which is, you know, we are at this moment where we are seeing hate normalized and seeing hate mainstream, right? Stuff that was previously on the fringes of society are now, you know, showing up in, you know, in our politicians are echoing some of these charges. And so it is incredibly important, you know, to organize, to speak out against this hate, to ensure that, you know, people who are espousing it are held accountable for their actions, and ensure that, again, the communities that are being directly targeted by this hate have the security and feel safe, you know, to be who they are.
Do you have any suggestions for trainings that would help us learn how to effectively and safely intervene should be that we observe such behaviors?
I wonder if the person, I don't know if we can unmute on that. I'm just curious what specific like thing that might be, like what exactly the person's looking for.
Hi, if someone is seeing something on campus, thank you for, by the way, thank you for this presentation.
Yeah, of course.
You know, often people want to intervene in some way or to say that's not okay. And, you know, that there may be effective strategies to do that in a way that is not confrontational, that will raise it to a higher level, or that would be safe for someone. I mean, you fight with this issue of how do you intervene in a way that is also safe.
Absolutely. No, it's incredibly important. So I know that we at the ADL, some of my colleagues do work in this space. And so Jake, maybe we can reach out afterwards, or you can contact us. I can put my email in, or Jake can put yours, and you can reach out. And I do want to make sure that's a really important question. Hang on one sec, at adl.org. And I want to make sure we get you the resources that you need to do that, because I think that it's a long and hard process, and one that requires a lot of nuance and delicacy. And so more than I can do in a quick minute response. So please do contact us, and we can get you resources that you need to do so.
Okay. The next question is, what should we keep an eye on campus to know if or what extremist groups are present here?
That's a great question. I think, you know, one of the things you can do is look back at the symbols, right? Take a look through the symbols, because again, extremists rely on symbols as a code to kind of alert people to the fact that they are there, you know, sometimes overtly to intimidate, but also sometimes just to, you know, to signal to other like-minded individuals who would recognize the symbol for what it is. So symbols are incredibly important in terms of recognizing extremists, the presence of extremists. And actually, I'll say that's what we use a lot. A lot of the work that we do relies on recognizing the symbols and understanding exactly, you know, what they're talking about, and you know, and getting a sense of, you know, using the symbols as a window into understanding their ideology. So understanding that type of stuff, I think, is really important. The second is, a lot of these groups don't hide, you know, what they are. So you can find Proud Boys that will identify as Proud Boys. You'll find 3%ers who identify as 3%ers, Oath Keepers, and so on and so forth, right? Because again, they don't think they're doing anything wrong, and they're trying to recruit. So a key thing in those moments is understanding, and obviously the ones I just named are the big ones, but understand the different groups that are active. So if you do come across a group that you might be concerned about, take a look online, right? Go to our extremist glossary and plug them in and see if there's any resources. Again, we've got backgrounders on numerous different types of things. And so you can kind of take a look and use the resources that we have to understand what exactly you're dealing with. And if it is confirmed that it is an extremist, do alert, you know, campus officials, because that is obviously of deep concern.
Okay, so if nobody else has any more questions, I would just like to thank you, Alex, for answering all of those questions. And I would like to then turn it over to Captain Mike Davis.
Thank you, Maddie. I think we all agree that this was a great presentation. I'd like to thank Jake Joseph and Alex Friedfeld from the ADL for their time today on such important content. I'd also like to thank and recognize the planning committee who put this together. All the names there are listed, who really worked behind the scenes to pull everything together. Thank you so much, and it's much appreciated. I'd just like to have a few closing words before we end today. If you witness or are the victim of any type of hate-related incident, please contact public safety so we can look into the matter, investigate, and if there are any criminal elements to what took place, the local law enforcement will be called in to take appropriate action. So just be aware that there is no place for these type of incidents, just to make us aware if you experience it. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Use your camera app on your smartphone to scan the QR code above to provide us with feedback on the program. And there's going to be a few more slides after this, which promotes a few more activities that are going to be coming up by the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement. So I'd like to thank you today. Be safe and enjoy the rest of your day.